William Jennings Bryan was a Nebraska orator and a towering political figure who became one of the most influential yet ultimately unsuccessful presidential candidates in American history. William Jennings Bryan, Democratic politician, lawyer, and reformer, was born in Salem, Illinois on March 19, 1860. He came from a devoutly religious family. He had a commanding presence with his powerful voice and magnetic speaking ability. Bryan's early years were marked by piety and intellectual curiosity. He attended Illinois College in Jacksonville, graduating as valedictorian in 1881. His education there shaped his understanding of politics and morality, though his later career would test those principles in ways he could never have imagined. After graduating from college, Bryan studied law at Union Law School in Chicago, though he completed his legal education by reading law in the office of Lyman Trumbull, a former senator. He was admitted to the bar in 1883 and began practicing law in Jacksonville, Illinois. During this time, Bryan was already developing his interest in politics and public speaking. He joined the Democratic Party and became active in local political affairs. His natural talent for oratory quickly set him apart from other young lawyers and politicians. In 1884, Bryan married Mary Elizabeth Baird, whom he had met while both were students. Mary was an intelligent and educated woman who had studied law herself. She became his partner in every sense, advising him on political matters and even helping him prepare his speeches. Their marriage was a genuine partnership, unusual for the time, and Mary's influence on Bryan's career cannot be overstated. They would have 3 children together, and the family remained close throughout Bryan's tumultuous political career. In 1887, Bryan moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, seeking greater opportunities in the rapidly growing western states. Nebraska was still a frontier state, full of farmers and small businessmen who would become Bryan's natural constituency. He established a successful law practice in Lincoln, but his real ambition lay in politics. The agricultural depression of the late 1880s was creating economic hardship for farmers, and Bryan saw an opportunity to champion their cause. In 1890, Bryan ran for Congress from Nebraska's 1st District. He was only 30 years old, but his speaking ability and his identification with farmers' grievances made him a formidable candidate. He campaigned tirelessly, traveling throughout the district and speaking at every crossroads and town hall. His message resonated with voters struggling with debt and falling crop prices. He won the election, becoming one of the youngest members of Congress. Bryan served 2 terms in the House of Representatives from 1891 to 1895. During his time in Congress, he established himself as a champion of Western agricultural interests and an opponent of Eastern financial power. He spoke frequently on the House floor, developing a reputation as one of the most effective orators in Washington. His speeches combined moral fervor with economic arguments, appealing to both the hearts and minds of his listeners. He advocated for lower tariffs, which he believed hurt farmers by raising the prices of manufactured goods while doing nothing to help agricultural prices. The dominant political issue of Bryan's congressional years was the money question, specifically the debate over whether the United States should maintain the gold standard or adopt bimetallism by coining silver as well as gold. Bryan became a passionate advocate for free silver, the unlimited coinage of silver at a ratio of 16:1 with gold. He argued that expanding the money supply through silver coinage would raise prices, helping debt-burdened farmers pay their mortgages and loans. Eastern bankers and creditors naturally opposed this policy, preferring the gold standard which protected the value of debts. The battle between gold and silver became a battle between creditors and debtors, between East and West, between financial interests and agricultural interests. In 1894, Bryan ran for the United States Senate but was defeated by the Nebraska legislature, which at that time elected senators. The loss was a setback, but Bryan used the time to build his national reputation. He traveled extensively, speaking at political gatherings and Chautauqua assemblies throughout the country. His speeches on the silver question made him the most prominent spokesman for the free silver movement. He became editor of the Omaha World Herald, giving him a platform to spread his views. By 1896, he had positioned himself as a leading voice in the Democratic Party, though he held no office and was only 36 years old. The Democratic National Convention of 1896 in Chicago would prove to be Bryan's moment of destiny. The party was deeply divided between supporters of President Grover Cleveland's conservative, gold standard policies and supporters of free silver. Bryan arrived at the convention as a delegate from Nebraska and a candidate for the presidential nomination, though he was considered a long shot against more established politicians. The convention debated the platform for days, with the money question dominating all discussion. Bryan was scheduled to speak in favor of the free silver plank. On July 9, 1896, William Jennings Bryan delivered what would become the most famous political speech in American history. The Cross of Gold speech was a masterpiece of political oratory. Bryan spoke without notes for 30 minutes, building his argument with religious imagery and emotional appeals. He defended the common people against the financial elites, farmers against bankers, the West against the East. The speech climaxed with words that would echo through American political history: "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." As Bryan stretched out his arms in the pose of crucifixion, the convention hall erupted in pandemonium. Delegates cheered, wept, and carried Bryan on their shoulders. The next day, the convention nominated him for president on the fifth ballot. Bryan's nomination transformed American politics. At 36, he was the youngest presidential nominee in history. His campaign would be unlike anything Americans had ever seen. While his Republican opponent, William McKinley, conducted a traditional front porch campaign from his home in Ohio, Bryan took his case directly to the people. He traveled over 18,000 miles by train, visiting 27 states and delivering over 600 speeches. He spoke to millions of Americans, often giving dozens of speeches in a single day. His energy seemed inexhaustible. He would speak from the rear platform of his train at every stop, addressing crowds that gathered to see the boy orator of the Platte. Bryan's campaign rhetoric was populist and moralistic. He portrayed the election as a battle between the common people and the plutocrats, between democracy and oligarchy. He spoke of farmers, laborers, and small businessmen as the producing classes who created the nation's wealth but were exploited by bankers and monopolists. His message appealed to rural Americans, to Southerners, and to Western miners, but it frightened Eastern businessmen and urban workers who feared that free silver would cause inflation and economic chaos. The Republican campaign painted Bryan as a dangerous radical who would destroy the economy and undermine American institutions. The 1896 campaign was one of the most intense in American history. The Republican Party, backed by enormous contributions from business interests, outspent Bryan's campaign by as much as 10-1. They distributed millions of pamphlets warning of the dangers of free silver. They organized speakers to counter Bryan's message. They pressured employers to tell their workers that factories would close if Bryan won. McKinley's campaign manager, Mark Hanna, raised unprecedented sums of money and ran a modern, organized campaign that overwhelmed Bryan's personal appeal. On election day, McKinley defeated Bryan by a margin of 271 to 176 electoral votes. Bryan carried the South and much of the West, but McKinley swept the Northeast and Midwest. Urban workers, immigrants, and middle-class voters had rejected Bryan's message. The defeat was devastating for Bryan personally and for the causes he championed. The gold standard was secure, and the power of Eastern financial interests was confirmed. Yet Bryan had won over 6.5 million votes and had fundamentally changed the Democratic Party, moving it away from Cleveland's conservatism toward a more populist, reform-oriented stance. After the 1896 defeat, Bryan might have retired from politics, but instead he remained the dominant figure in the Democratic Party. He founded a weekly newspaper, The Commoner, which he edited and published from Lincoln. The paper spread his political views and kept him in the public eye. He continued to travel and speak, commanding large fees on the lecture circuit. He became wealthy from his speaking engagements, which allowed him to pursue politics without financial worry. He remained the leader of the Democratic Party's progressive wing, advocating for reforms like the direct election of senators, women's suffrage, and the income tax. In 1900, the Democrats nominated Bryan for president again. The campaign was fought largely over imperialism, as the United States had acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and other territories following the Spanish-American War. Bryan opposed imperialism on moral grounds, arguing that it contradicted American principles of self-government and consent of the governed. However, the issue did not resonate with voters as the silver question had. The country was prosperous, and McKinley was a popular incumbent. Bryan lost again, this time by a larger margin than in 1896. The defeat suggested that Bryan's moment had passed, that his style of politics was becoming obsolete in an increasingly urban and industrial America. Bryan remained active in politics despite 2 defeats. He supported progressive reforms and continued to speak throughout the country. In 1908, the Democrats nominated him for president a 3rd time, making him the first person to receive 3 presidential nominations from a major party. By this time, however, Bryan's message had been adopted by others. Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican president, had implemented many progressive reforms that Bryan had advocated. The Republican nominee, William Howard Taft, promised to continue Roosevelt's policies. Bryan lost again, carrying only the South and a handful of western states. 3 presidential defeats might have destroyed another politician's career, but Bryan remained influential in the Democratic Party. In 1912, Bryan played a crucial role in securing the Democratic nomination for Woodrow Wilson. At a deadlocked convention, Bryan's support proved decisive in breaking the stalemate in Wilson's favor. When Wilson won the presidency, he rewarded Bryan by appointing him Secretary of State. It was the highest office Bryan would ever hold, and he approached it with his characteristic moral fervor. As Secretary of State, Bryan negotiated cooling-off treaties with numerous nations, agreements that required disputes to be submitted to investigation before resorting to war. He believed these treaties would help prevent future conflicts. He also worked to promote American business interests abroad while maintaining his anti-imperialist principles, a difficult balance. Bryan's tenure as Secretary of State was marked by his pacifist convictions. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, Bryan was determined to keep the United States neutral. He believed that American neutrality should be absolute and impartial, with no favoritism toward either the Allies or the Central Powers. However, as the war progressed, Wilson and other administration officials increasingly sympathized with Britain and France. German submarine warfare, particularly the sinking of ships carrying American passengers, created pressure for a stronger American response. Bryan opposed sending strong protests to Germany, fearing they would lead to war. He also believed that Americans who traveled on British ships through war zones were taking unnecessary risks and should not expect their government to protect them. The breaking point came in May 1915 when a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 people including 128 Americans. Wilson drafted a strong note of protest to Germany, demanding that submarine warfare against passenger ships cease. Bryan believed the note was too harsh and would lead to war. He argued that the United States should also protest British violations of neutral rights, particularly the naval blockade that prevented American goods from reaching Germany. When Wilson refused to modify his position, Bryan resigned as Secretary of State on June 9, 1915. It was a principled stand that cost him his position but remained consistent with his pacifist beliefs. Bryan's resignation was controversial. Some praised his consistency and moral courage. Others accused him of abandoning his president in a time of crisis. Bryan spent the next 2 years speaking against American entry into the war, though he always insisted he would support the country if war came. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, Bryan, true to his word, offered to serve in any capacity, even as a private soldier, though he was 57 years old. The offer was declined, but Bryan supported the war effort and spoke in favor of Liberty Bonds. After the war, Bryan remained active in Democratic politics and continued his lecture tours, but his influence was waning. The 1920s were a time of urban growth, cultural change, and prosperity that seemed to leave Bryan's rural, moralistic politics behind. Yet Bryan found a new cause that would define his final years: opposition to the teaching of evolution in public schools. Bryan had always been a devout Christian who believed in the literal truth of the Bible. He saw evolutionary theory as a threat to religious faith and moral values. He believed that teaching evolution undermined belief in God and led to moral relativism and social disorder. Bryan became the leading spokesman for the anti-evolution movement. He wrote articles, gave speeches, and lobbied state legislatures to pass laws prohibiting the teaching of evolution in public schools. Several states, mostly in the South, passed such laws. Critics mocked Bryan as an ignorant fundamentalist trying to suppress scientific knowledge, but Bryan insisted he was defending religious freedom and parental rights. He argued that in a democracy, the majority of citizens, who were Christians, had the right to determine what was taught in tax-supported schools. In 1925, Bryan's crusade against evolution reached its climax in Dayton, Tennessee. A high school teacher named John Scopes had been arrested for violating Tennessee's law against teaching evolution. The American Civil Liberties Union offered to defend Scopes, and the trial became a national sensation. When Bryan agreed to assist the prosecution, the famous lawyer Clarence Darrow joined the defense. The Scopes trial, as it became known, was really a trial of fundamentalism versus modernism, rural values versus urban sophistication, traditional religion versus scientific rationalism. The trial began on July 10, 1925. Dayton was overwhelmed with reporters, spectators, and vendors selling everything from lemonade to toy monkeys. Bryan arrived as a champion of traditional values, but he found himself in an unfamiliar role. He was not a scientist or a theologian, and Darrow was a skilled attorney who knew how to exploit weaknesses. The trial proceeded for several days with testimony about what Scopes had taught and whether he had violated the law. Then, in a dramatic turn, Darrow called Bryan himself as a witness, asking him to testify as an expert on the Bible. Bryan accepted, believing he could defend the Bible against Darrow's attacks. What followed was a devastating cross-examination. Darrow asked Bryan about biblical miracles and contradictions, about the age of the earth and the literal truth of Genesis. Bryan defended biblical literalism but was forced to admit that some biblical passages might be interpreted figuratively. He struggled to answer questions about science and history. The examination made Bryan appear ignorant and foolish, at least to the reporters covering the trial. The next day, the judge ruled that Bryan's testimony was irrelevant and struck it from the record. Scopes was convicted and fined $100, but the conviction was later overturned on a technicality. The trial was widely seen as a defeat for Bryan and for fundamentalism, though anti-evolution laws remained on the books in several states for decades. 5 days after the trial ended, on July 26, 1925, William Jennings Bryan died in his sleep in Dayton, Tennessee. He was 65 years old. The cause of death was reported as apoplexy, likely a stroke or heart attack, though some suggested that the strain of the trial had contributed to his death. Bryan's funeral was held in Washington, D.C., and he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Thousands attended his funeral, and tributes poured in from across the country, though some of his critics could not resist noting that he had died just days after his humiliation at Dayton. Bryan's legacy is complex and contradictory. He was a champion of common people who never won the presidency. He was a progressive reformer whose final crusade was against scientific education. He was a powerful orator who shaped American politics for 3 decades yet ended his life as a figure of ridicule to many educated Americans. He advocated for many reforms that were eventually adopted, including the direct election of senators, the income tax, and women's suffrage, yet he is remembered today primarily for the Scopes trial and his opposition to evolution. Modern historians have been more sympathetic to Bryan than his contemporaries were. They recognize that his populism, while sometimes demagogic, was rooted in genuine concern for ordinary Americans struggling against economic forces beyond their control. They acknowledge that his anti-imperialism was principled and prescient. They note that his pacifism, while impractical, came from sincere moral conviction. They understand that his opposition to evolution, while scientifically wrong, reflected the views of millions of Americans who saw their traditional values under attack from modern secular culture. Yet even with these qualifications, Bryan remains a puzzling figure. He was a man of the 19th century trying to lead America in the 20th. His oratory, so powerful in an age of public speaking, seemed old-fashioned in the age of radio and motion pictures. His rural, agricultural constituency was being displaced by urban, industrial workers. His religious fundamentalism was increasingly at odds with modern intellectual life. He lived long enough to see his style of politics become obsolete, his causes either defeated or adopted by others, and his reputation diminished by the Scopes trial. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of William Jennings Bryan is that he was a great man who never achieved greatness. He had extraordinary talents as a speaker and politician. He championed important causes and influenced American politics profoundly. He was sincere, morally earnest, and personally incorruptible in an age of political corruption. Yet he never won the presidency, never achieved his major policy goals during his lifetime, and ended his career as a symbol of backwardness to many Americans. His 3 presidential defeats marked him as the greatest loser in American political history, a title that hardly does justice to his influence and accomplishments. Bryan represents a particular type of American leader, the populist reformer who speaks for the common people against the elites but whose vision is ultimately too narrow or too backward-looking to succeed. History is full of such figures, men who tap into genuine grievances and real injustices but whose solutions are inadequate or whose worldview cannot accommodate the complexities of modern life. Bryan's tragedy was not that he lacked ability or principle, but that his principles were rooted in a vanishing world. In the end, William Jennings Bryan was neither a prophet nor a fool, but rather a talented politician and sincere reformer who outlived his time. His legacy includes both progressive reforms that improved American democracy and a final crusade against science that embarrassed his supporters. He is remembered today for the Cross of Gold speech and the Scopes trial, for 3 presidential defeats and 1 humiliating cross-examination. This is perhaps unfair to a man who served his causes faithfully and influenced American politics for an entire generation, but history is often unkind to those who fight against the future.